In 1948, reform changed the way the welfare state looked after the needy, the sick and the disabled in Britain. The few poor laws that have still been in existence since the reign of Queen Elizabeth I was finally abolished. Up until now, many people in need of assistance who were not entitled to any help from the government were now up to some degree to get national benefits under the new National Assistance Act. Up until this time, unmarried mothers, the homeless, people who had not contributed, and some sick would still have to rely on church and charities to provide shelter and food aid. Authorities were given grants to help provide meals and accommodation for the elderly and the disabled. This was done by providing cash to voluntary organisations. Recreational facilities were also made available from the National Assistance Board, which replaced the previous Unemployment Assistance Board in 1946. These facilities would include day centres for the elderly, providing a hot meal and social clubs to give people a sense of community and avoiding isolation. For the first time, claimants who had not paid contributions could claim alongside anyone else, along with single parents. Benefits were risen to a standard of living, albeit it wasn't a fortune, and a rent allowance had become available. However, this was a standard rent payment and didn't reflect the amount payable by the tenant. The rate for a married couple had increased weekly from 31 to 40 shillings, about £2, which is about £98 a week as of today in 2025. To see this in perspective, a single person received £47 in a week in 1949 in today's money. But as of 2025, universal credit rates show a weekly payment of £93 as an entitlement for a single claimant. The standard rent allowance back in 1948 was 55p a week. When assisted to look for employment, people were forced to take any job, even though some would find it detrimental to their health. And there were a lot of disabilities that weren't recognised by civil servants or the National Assistance Board, and they too were forced to take work. They were assisted to find tailored work that would suit them rather than harder labour. In 1949, what we would class as people with disabilities now had a 96 rate of being in work, percentage-wise. Today, that figure is 47%, quoted by the ONS, National Statistics. Immigrants who came to the country for work had no rights to claim, even if they had found employment and since lost their jobs. They were sent to work on farms or other menial jobs. There were many citizens from the West Indies and the Caribbean invited to work in the UK after the war, as we had a high demand for filling jobs such as the public transport sector. This was called the Windrush. Some people understandably could not cope with the tensions delivered from racism and left their employment, sometimes for their own safety. This was never factored into the decision of the board, and no benefits were paid. It's awful to hear that racism was accepted by so many. Family allowance came into effect in 1945 after 25 years of campaigning from Eleanor Rathbone, an independent MP and suffrage campaigner. She pioneered the beginning of this non-means tested benefit. Payment was granted for every child at a rate of 5 shillings per week per child after the first child. Large families could not support their children on their current incomes in most cases, so this was designed for the larger populated household. Family allowance itself has a lot of history, so let's go back to where it began. Recommended by the Beveridge Report, family allowance was debated with negativity to begin with, but eventually was introduced with a watered-down version of its original pledge. The cash amount was to be 8 shillings per child, which would increase by the child's age, but that was not availed. The 5 shilling weekly payment did not increase until 1953, with the first child still receiving nothing. Later on in years, this would include the first child, as it was seen necessary for a healthy family to be more productive, and education was based on good nutrition. As this became a non-tested benefit, the Labour government in 1970 did not want to increase the payments too much, but it did want to consider less better off families and introduced a means-tested benefit, FIS, Family Income Supplement. For less well-off families, this would be for their offsprings. The withdrawal of provision for milk to children in the mid-1970s proved unpopular, but this was taken away in the wake of FIS. More on child benefits later. Maternity allowance was introduced in 1948 and was payable for those not working for 13 weeks and was increased to 18 weeks in 1953. The quote from Winston Churchill from Cradle to Grave was aimed at everyone in Britain, meaning an end to want and sickness by means of social insurance. But still, many people were slipping through the net. This was about to be changed. The National Health Service also began in 1948, which made a free health service for everyone in the UK. Prescriptions were free, eyeglasses were free, but as the health service began to become more expensive for the Treasury, charges came into force for glasses and prescriptions in 1951, introduced by Churchill as 1 shilling per medicine. Supplementary benefit was introduced in 1966 in place of national assistance. This was for both employed and unemployed people who needed an extra supplement in order to meet the criteria of having enough income to support themselves and their families. Many working families could not earn enough money, particularly the larger families on wages alone. It was a means-tested benefit that gave them a livable income, according to the state. The school leaving age was raised to 16 in 1972, and school leavers would go to their local employment offices to collect a national insurance number card, and if not working, could make a claim for benefits. This age was raised to 18 in later years with the introduction of Job Seekers Allowance, and in 2025 it was raised again. The famous green GIRO cheque. GIRO cheques were introduced in the same year and was paid every week to a claimant, mostly by posting them, and they were normally received within 2 working days of a person signing on. The word GIRO simply means circulation of money. Some people had GIRO books with a weekly tear-off cheque, whilst few had personal issue. The GIROs, as abbreviated, were taken to a post office in order to be cashed, without waiting for the cheque to be cleared, as with the books. Personal issue was a cheque collected from the Dole office, normally the same one as a person would sign on in cases of insecure postal addresses, typically areas prone to delivery theft or no-go areas for postal workers. Initially, GIRO cheques could be cashed at any post office with the production of identification, but later on in the 80s, they were crossed and could only be cashed at designated post offices, normally the nearest to their homes. When applying for any benefits, one would have to fill in a famous B1 form, where the client would nominate a post office when filling it in. This was not a form, but not so fondly remembered as a thick book of questions asking every detail of a person's life. Signing on was the term given to people attending a Dole office once a week with a signing card to declare that you had not worked and had been looking for employment since the last time they visited. This was extended to a fortnightly sign-on payment in the 1980s to cut costs. People who had worked and paid national insurance contributions could claim unemployment benefit, which was slightly higher than a non-contributory benefit, and did not have any effect on the level of payments that the claimant had if they had savings, as opposed to supplementary benefit, which took into account of any monies the claimant had saved. The value of £6,000 was the asset limit of not being eligible for any payments. Unemployment benefit was initially paid for up to 12 months depending on whether there were enough national insurance contributions paid in, but then it was cut down to 6 months of entitlement in the 2000s. Attendance allowance was introduced in 1970, awarding a non-contributory payment for those who had, without assistance, would otherwise need to go into residential care and could get around-the-clock care from their homes. Families or a nominated carer in the neighbourhood would normally be the person they trusted and chose for this benefit, thus allowing their own dignity. Introduced under Edward Heath's government in 1971, invalidity benefit was paid to those who sustained a life-changing injury that would incapacitate a person, or for those who had long-term debilitating illnesses. This was awarded after proof of health and age. For some reason, education was also taken into consideration. It was classed as a long-term benefit, thus making the criteria of entitlement very strict. Payments will be at a higher rate than general out-of-work benefits. Invalid carers allowance was introduced in 1976 as a non-taxable weekly payment for those caring for the chronically sick or disabled in their own home. It was later abbreviated to carers allowance and remains that title to this very day. However, it is a taxable benefit. Budgeting grants were introduced in 1970, which was a one-off payment for those on means-tested benefit in order to purchase replacement items needed in their home. Among the items included beds, furniture, bedclothes. Luxury items were exempt, which would include fridges and freezers, and in the early years, washing machines. A person would have to have been receiving a non-contributory benefit for more than 6 months, and sometimes inspections were made to ensure the money was well spent. This was phased out later in years and replaced with budgeting loans, which will be covered later on. In 1979, child tax allowance was removed, so child benefit was increased to £4 per child. This was to increase with inflation throughout the 1980s, until the rates were frozen from 1988 to 1990 in order to curb welfare spending. In 1991, the payments began to rise again, with the introduction of a slight increase for the first child. The lone parent rate was abandoned in 1998 under Tony Blair's new Labour government. Nowadays, some recipients donate their child benefits for charity, for example, the lovely Cape Princess Windsor, with the money being paid direct to their beneficiaries from the government. The state pension was revamped in the 1970s, with the yearly increases based on national salaries and the wider economy, as opposed to inflation, in order to give them a fairer increase and enjoy the nation's prosperity. By 1979, the rules were changed to inflation increases only. This would lead to lower rises in payments by up to 16%, causing much controversy over the years, as pensioners were getting worse off. Since 2010, a triple lock scheme has been introduced as a benchmark for a pension's annual increase. This would include CPI, RPI and general inflation.